Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Mary Price. I'm the Events and Marketing Manager at the Shingo Institute at Utah State University. I'm pleased to have Doug Dawson with us today. He's with Leg Up Solutions. They are a Shingo licensed affiliate. Doug is certified to teach all of the Shingo workshops, and he consistently receives high ratings from participants. If you haven't had a chance to experience a workshop with Doug, I would encourage you to do so. If you also have not had a chance to read the article that he wrote today about compliance versus commitment, I would encourage you to go to our website, shingo.org, click on the blog, and you'll find the article there. Doug, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I'll turn the time over to you.
Well, thank you, Mary. I appreciate that. And I appreciate the opportunity to be with you all here today and to talk about something that for me is very personal and I feel very passionate about. So let's get going. I'd like to try and take about 20 minutes and then open up the last 7 minutes for Q&A. So let's get rolling. Hang on. I said let's get rolling, but then I lied, didn't I? All right. So when we started our business, actually a few months before we started our business, I read an article in Fortune magazine, and there was a quote in that article that just really stood out to me. And Stephen Jay Gould, he was an evolutionary biologist and a professor at Harvard University who's since passed away. But he said, somehow I am less interested in the weight and convolutions of Einstein's brain than I am in the certainty that people of equal talent have lived and died in the cotton fields and sweatshops. I think that's a powerful statement, and it kind of speaks indirectly to the sometimes the behavior that we have of not seeing the forest for the trees. We get down into the weeds, we get down into the technical details, and we don't see really the available talent that is existing out there. So that's what I wanted to talk to you a little bit about today in terms of commitment versus compliance, because this is critically important to tap into that latent talent. I found that a lot of organizations that are on their journey of excellence have this roadblock, and the roadblock is actually something that's good, but how it's handled causes it to not be so good, and that's lean tools. Now, don't get me wrong, I am all about lean tools, and I think that they're really important. But we sometimes get so ensconced in the technical aspects of those tools and making sure that they're in place, making sure that people are using those tools, that it becomes a roadblock to organizational excellence simply because the focus is on the tools. And that kind of drives this idea of compliance that I've been thinking about for some time now. When we're in the workshops, the Shingo workshops, I almost always use a quote, and I can't say where I heard it, but I loved it. I wrote it down and I use it consistently. And those of you that have been in our workshops have heard me say this, but the first part of the quote is this: when the boss leaves the room, compliance leaves the room with the boss. I'm going to repeat that. When the boss leaves the room, compliance leaves the room with the boss. What that suggests is that adherence to lean tools, lean practices requires oversight. It requires policing. And that is not, that becomes a stumbling block to every organization's journey of excellence if they focus so heavily on those tools and compliance with those tools. I'm going to give you some examples here. So a lot of times what we see with 5S and 6S, 6S is where we add safety to the 5S. We see where audits and reviews are only completed when they're asked for, when the manager or the responsible person is saying, hey, you know, it's the end of the month, it's the end of the week, we really need this. And then they're submitted, and it's kind of a check the box exercise. It's being compliant with what is expected. Work instruction adherence. A lot of times, and we'll see this when we go to the Gemba a lot, we'll see people that will talk about the work instructions, but then they'll talk about how the work instructions are not accurate. And so they have a workaround. And the problem with that is that they're being compliant with the work instructions only when required, when somebody's looking over their shoulder, when the quality professional is watching the step that's being performed, or whatever the case may be. So we'll talk about the other end of that in a moment, but I just give these as examples because I want you to be thinking about this in terms of your organization and what behaviors you see. Coaching behaviors. Coaching behaviors is really interesting because a lot of times what will happen is if a peer observes a behavior that they're not comfortable with by somebody else, or that is not appropriate, rather than approach that peer and provide direct feedback in coaching, they'll go to the boss because they don't want to be found out, and they can tell the boss, and they're being compliant with the speak up policy within the organization. But that places the onus of responsibility on the boss to go provide the coaching. When the boss goes and provides the coaching, it's sometimes accepted, oftentimes like vinegar, and then this person will be compliant when the boss is around, but not so much when nobody's around to observe them. One of my favorite ones is improvement suggestions. And when we're at the Gemba, I like to go to the tier board, or we'll get to tier boards and huddle boards in a moment. But and I like to pull out the suggestions and see what kind of dates we have on those. And sometimes you'll see a slug of them that are done at the end of the month. So we have, as our organization exists, we have, and I'm not talking about Leg Up Solutions, I'm just talking euphemistically, but everybody's supposed to complete 6 improvement suggestions at the over the course of the month. And then you've got 300 employees, which means that the last week and maybe the last day of the month, you've got 1,800 improvement suggestions. That's not sustainable. It's not, it's definitely evidence of being compliant rather than being committed. And then the last one, I actually learned this from Dan Fleming. I don't know if Dan's on the call or not. I hope he is, but I learned this from Dan Fleming, and he taught me a question to ask at the Gamba when we're at huddle boards and tier boards. And I love this question because it's so telling. It talks about, the response tells you about commitment versus compliance. And the question is this: who's the information on the huddle board for? Now, often what we'll hear is, well, it's there because the managers want it. They put it there for us. But the very fact that managers is in the conversation suggests that they're being compliant. How often do you have to fill that out? How often do you have to complete this? Well, we're supposed to do it in such and such a time frame. This tells us that it's an attitude of compliance, and that's really a roadblock to organizational excellence. I really hate compliance. It's not productive. What compliance suggests is that people are only doing what they have to do when they feel like they have to do it. And that's not to say that people are avoiding being committed. That's not to say that people are bad and that they don't want to be committed. All that's saying is that we've created systems that allow them to be compliant rather than committed, that don't encourage commitment. So I think that's really an important thing. And those examples are just a few. There's 100 of them. You can think about your own organization. So think about that statement, though. I'll go back to it real quick. When the boss leaves the room, compliance leaves the room with the boss. Now I'll finish the quote. The remainder of the quote is, when the boss leaves the room, commitment, and notice that I've got commitment here in capital letters. All throughout this slide presentation, commitment is in capital letters because it's so important. But when the boss leaves the room, commitment stays in the room. So that suggests that commitment doesn't require any policing. It doesn't require anybody looking over your shoulder to be sure that you're doing what you say you're going to do or what you agreed to do. it implies that you're doing it because you want to do it. So if you think about the Gary Peterson videos in the Shingo workshops, he's talking about the Gemba cards, and he holds those Gemba cards and he says, and he kind of, I don't know if I can do a good Gary Peterson. I hope he's not on the call, but he says, no, I'm not so much interested in people doing this because they have to do it. I'm more interested in them doing it because they want to do it. If you've ever been to OC Tanner and seen the organization of excellence that Gary Peterson and his staff have built, you'll find that people are very committed and they're doing things because they want to do it. So let's give some examples. Oh, isn't that interesting? All these examples are the same. It's just a double-edged sword. So 5S and 6S audits and reviews. Not only are they being done where they're supposed to be done, but there's actually improvement suggestions and how we can make the 5S for our workspace better. I think that's really powerful. Work instruction adherence. Not only are people adhering to the work instructions, but by adhering to the work instructions, because they're committed to doing so, they find opportunities for improvement. And instead of doing the workaround and ignoring the opportunity for improvement, they're escalating, or even more importantly, making the changes themselves necessary to drive that improvement because of adherence to the work instructions. What about coaching? I think coaching is a really good one. I was at an organizational excellence indexing function activity not that long ago. It was last month. And the organization that we were assessing, it was really interesting because they had some team member meetings. So they had the team leader and the team members, and these people, the team members, were giving really honest and direct feedback to their peers about their performance. But the thing that fascinated me wasn't the directness of the information. What fascinated me is that nobody felt picked on. And everybody that got that feedback said, hey, you know what? I really appreciate that. Here's what we're going to do. How do we prevent this from happening for other folks? It was codified right there in the meeting minutes. I was really, really impressed. And so coaching behaviors associated with commitment allow us to take the waste out of communication. I like to call that lean communication. Take the waste out of communication and get right to the crux of the matter, to the person who needs to hear the information. And that's a good example of being committed. So improvement suggestions. This is another one that I love. I was with an organization, a different organization last month, and they reported that in August, they had 2,500, almost 2,600 executed improvement suggestions in an organization of 830 individuals. What that suggests is that that's about, as I recall, that's about 3 completed improvement suggestions per month per individual. That's pretty powerful. So it wasn't just improvement suggestions made, it was improvement suggestions executed. That was a key metric for them. But in order to do that, you have to have an organization that's committed. You have to have people within an organization that's committed to the true north or the purpose of that organization. And then tier huddle boards. Same thing. When you go to the Gemba and you're looking at a huddle board, and the operators are very focused on what their business is and what's going on, it's pretty powerful. I've been in huddle meetings where managers are focused on the huddle boards, but where you see the operators driving the meetings and understanding their business and finding opportunities for improvement within that whole process, it's pretty powerful. I was at an organization last October, and at that organization, I was at a tier board, and there were operators around the tier board, and they were telling me about their kata process. Now, you tell me you don't have to tell me because this isn't a workshop and I'm not going to make anybody say anything. But I want you to think about this. Um, is this evidence of commitment or compliance? But anyway, when an operator had a suggestion, they'd fill out a COTA card and put it on the tier board or the huddle board, and it would be open for comment for 2 or 3 days, and all their peers would comment on it. And they encourage it to be honest feedback, and nobody takes it personally because they want the best improvement possible that can come from that particular suggestion. After 2 or 3 days, the comments are reviewed and they decide as a group whether the project or whether the suggestion should be piloted. And so if they say no, then they don't throw it away. They just file it for another day because it might not be relevant right now. It may be relevant at a later time. And so they file it away and keep it for future reference in case there's an opportunity to implement it later. But if it goes to pilot, they set up a pilot for a couple of weeks. And then at the end of the pilot, they put the results up, and then everybody is allowed to give feedback. And I usually say butcher it. They're allowed to butcher it as much as possible. And then they decide as a group, do we need run another pilot, or do we implement? And if they decide to run another pilot, it goes through the same process. There's a feedback on what went wrong, what could have happened better. And eventually they get to the point where after the second pilot, it's do we implement or do we table it? We never scrap it. Do we implement it or do we table it? We'll just put it back into our file because it may not be relevant now. It might be relevant another time. These are operators. These are operators that are doing this. Now tell me, are these people committed or are they being compliant? My belief is that they are absolutely committed, and I think that's pretty powerful. So that's one example of huddle boards. And again, there's a million others that you could find in terms of examples for commitment, but it's really important to understand the value of commitment versus compliance. Now, the reason I think that there's a value there is if people are being compliant, what that means is that we're technically competent around the lean tools, but we may not be competent with regard to culture. And that leads me to my next slide, which is something Ken Snyder said, and you'll find it in the Shingo model booklet that goes with all the workshops that we facilitate, those of us that are facilitators and affiliates. But Ken said, culture is the sum of the behaviors of the people within an organization. Now, those of you that have been in our workshops, I modify that a little bit. And Ken was in a workshop that we facilitated a couple of weeks ago, and he heard me say this, and he actually started writing something down. So I don't know, maybe this will change. But what we say in our practice is that culture is the mean of the behaviors of the people within the organization. And the reason we say it's the mean is because that accounts for outliers. And this is really important in understanding commitment versus compliance. So, and for those of you that may need a refresher in summary statistics, the mean is just the average of all the data points within a data set. And let's consider everybody within our organization a data point, and the culture is the data set. If we have somebody that's really exuberant about the culture, what happens when, and they're clearly an outlier, that may be a little irritating from time to time, but ultimately what they're doing is they're pulling the mean of the culture of that organization up. Now, what if they're really toxic and they are maybe not actively, but passively sabotaging the process on this journey of excellence? They're pulling the mean of the culture of that organization down. So in our practice, we like to say culture is the mean of the behaviors of the people within an organization because it accounts for the effect that those outliers have on the organization. I'll come back to that in just a moment, and time is running short, so I got to hustle. But I use this in workshops when I can, when it's relevant. I was at a workshop last month where we had some healthy discussion around this. This is just a sample of a distribution, two different types of normal distributions. I don't want to get into the math behind the statistics. It's the graphic that I'm really interested in. So if we have a lot of outliers within, and they're extreme outliers within our organization, this red dotted line that centers on the mean, this red dotted line is what our organization might look like. Now, this organization that I had the opportunity to participate a couple of weeks ago, well, last month in the OEI, the Organizational Excellence Index assessment, their organization was more like this. And the reason it was like that is because they were very focused on understanding who were the outliers. And they were very focused on trying to give those folks experiences that would help them change their perceptions. So I'm going to talk about that here next. And I want you to take a look at this graphic. So we have this continuum of compliance versus commitment. And we want to move people from compliance, an attitude of compliance, to an attitude of commitment. But in order to do that, and I can't take credit for this, this is in a book that somebody wrote that I was told about in a presentation at this site that I was at last month. But I thought it was very applicable to this idea of commitment versus compliance. But people's beliefs are based on experiences. So what we want to do is we want to give people experiences that change their beliefs. And by changing their beliefs or shift their beliefs, by shifting or changing those beliefs, their behaviors change. And when their behaviors change, the results improve. So let me give you a practical example. This example comes from the same organization where I saw this. They have a leading indicator, and I wrote about this not long ago, called the fixer-finder ratio. And the fixer-finder ratio is the number of fixers over the number of finders within an organization. The ideal is 1. And they felt like they were way below 0.1, but their true north, what they aspired to, was 1. Now, the way they did that was creating experiences that changed people's beliefs so that their behaviors changed, and that influenced results. And this is how they did it. They took a look at their data and they realized that people that have a really positive experience in a I'm using these terms specifically, well-planned and well-executed Kaizen event are 5 times more likely to submit improvement suggestions than those who do not participate in such an event. So what is the organization doing? They're helping as many people within the organization that they can to have experiences in these Kaizen events that are well planned and well executed, because they want solid suggestions for improvement. They also want people that are interested in becoming fixers rather than just finders. And this is the same organization that reported 2,500 executed improvement suggestions in the month of August. I think that's very powerful. So moving ahead here, the shingle model enables us to do that. And I've only got a couple of minutes. I took longer than I wanted to. The shingle model helps us do that. I was going to walk you through the shingle model very quickly. I'm not going to in the interest of time. You can find that model on the Shingo website. There's a number of people, including myself, Mary Price, and others, who can get you access to this model if you don't know where to find it. But as we take that Shingo model and we put it in a paradigm of commitment versus compliance, it looks kind of like this. So on the y-axis here, we have compliance and commitment. This is the compliance versus commitment continuum. So down here in compliance, we're focusing primarily on tools. That's technical. That's technical. We're building an inventory of tools, but those tools are not being used. And that's the thing that's concerning to me. Compliance suggests that our lean program within the organization is a push system rather than a pull system. And that's very important. But as we mature, we start to understand how systems are important to shaping the kind of tools that we use to get the results that we want. And that principles help inform the kind of behaviors that we see within those systems producing the results that we want. That takes us to a level of commitment and cultural maturity. So this is a technical and cultural competence or maturity continuum. This is really important to understand because this is what the Shingle model is trying to help us drive. We want to get away from compliance. We want to get away from people doing it because somebody's policing us to do it. We want people to do it because that's what they want to do. They have commitment. So we have this journey of excellence. And on our journey of excellence, we focus on the Shingle model to help change, to change the beliefs across the organization. And what that enables us to do is to achieve organizational excellence. Now, I'm not going to say that companies that are well on their journey, very mature, don't have their failings. They don't have their trips, slips, and falls, but they recover quickly and they have fewer of them. And that's because people are committed and they are a vibrant and vital learning organization. And so what that does is that takes us back to Stephen Jay Gould and his statement that I am somehow less interested in the weight and convolutions of Einstein's brain than I am in the certainty that people of equal talent have lived and died in the cotton fields and sweatshops. Those people are in your shop floors, on your shop floors. They're in your back office. They're on your front line. They might be just team members. They could be managers. They could even be in the C-suite. But we're not creating an attitude and an environment of commitment. When we do that, then we'll be able to tap into the latent talent within the organization. And let me tell you, there's tons of it. There's just a ton of it. And I say that with all my heart. I believe that. I come from the shop floor. Anyway, my time is up. I've chewed up your time. Thank you so much. And what questions do we have? I see a couple up there, Mary.
Yes, thank you so much, Doug. Thanks everyone for attending as well. I know that we are at our 30-minute limit. However, we will have a recording, so if you have to drop off, you can come back and review the questions afterward. We do have a few questions, Doug, if you're okay to answer those still.
Yeah, please.
Perfect. Okay, so our first question is, how do you overcome the lean wall without breaking the reliability of it?
How do you overcome the lean wall without breaking the reliability of it? So reliability actually comes from commitment. When you have a culture that's highly committed and people within the culture that are highly committed, that improves your reliability. So I would say focus on the culture. Focusing on the culture creates a pull system for those tools. And that will help you to bypass that lean tools wall. You have to think about the culture and developing a culture that is focused on commitment. A quick sidebar to that is what drives commitment. If you don't know, then read the Shingo model booklet. Get the Shingo the Shingo books, the Discover Excellence, Systems Design, Continuous Improvement. Those books talk about indirectly about commitment. But what you want to do is people have to have an emotional attachment to what it is you're doing. I think about Autoleave, and they say we save lives. And when you talk to people at Autoleave, particularly in the days of Tom Hartman, when you ask somebody what they were doing, they would tell you, even on the shop floor, they would tell you in terms of what they were doing and how that helped save people's lives. So hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you. Next question. Can you speak to building culture commitment without first focusing on tools as the groundwork?
I think it's kind of a hybrid approach, and people. So this is the kind of question that I get dinged the most on. So thank you, Mary, for mentioning that. I get high results from the workshops that we facilitate, but quite honestly, I get some really low scores. And those scores come around questions like this because of my response. My response is this: it depends. The secret sauce for what works in your organization is within the four walls of your own organization. I was reading this morning in Runner's World magazine about how you should prepare your meals for a marathon that you're going to run, or any kind of long distance running that's over 2 hours. What's the best way to do it? And the author, I loved this. The author said, there are millions of people out there that will take your money to give you a check the box formulaic approach. But the truth, and this is the author saying this, and I'm paraphrasing, the truth of the matter is that it depends on every individual, because their digestive system is different. Everybody's digestive system is different. How people assimilate energy is different. How you run is different. The mechanics of your running, your strength, all these factors come into play. So for a formulaic response, it's not going to work. The secret sauce for organizational excellence is within the walls of your own organization. That's vague and ambiguous, I know, but it's true, and it's hard. And if you look for it there, you'll find it.
Thank you. One more question. How do we maintain our culture in a hybrid world?
That's an interesting question. I can't speak to that because, again, I think that just depends on your organization. But I'll tell you what I do. So some of you are familiar with this, but this is my personal stack. I actually have them right here on my desk. And I don't know if you can see that or not, but you can't. But these are cards. These are cards. They've got my name on the front. I wrote a book several years ago called The Only Bad Mistake You Make Is the One You Never Learn From, and that's on the back here. And when somebody does something that is noteworthy, I fill out a card and I send it to them. I also have company branded cards. This is for personal stuff. I have company branded cards. I do the same thing with for clients and organizations that I want to recognize. And I think that you have to think about what gets people involved and motivated. And it's not formulaic. It's how much we're investing in them and how much they feel like we're investing in them. And I think that if you want a formulaic response, it's pretty broad and vague and ambiguous. But I think that's the best way to do it. It just has to work for you and for the organization. What is that? You have to figure that out yourselves. Once you do, I always say this too. Once you figure out how to figure it out, it's easy to replicate.
Absolutely. Well, that's all we have time for today. I know there are several other questions. I will forward those directly to Doug and he can follow up directly with you. Thank you so much, Doug, for the presentation today. It was great. Thanks to all the attendees for coming, and make sure to come next month. You can check out our schedule on shingo.org/events. We have webinars every month. So hope to see you again. Take care.
Thank you.